Okay, so it's 1:30. I see our participant levels are up over 200. Well, in the interest of time, we should probably get started. So welcome to the Is It Really a Big Deal session. Your host is Roger Schoenfeld, and he's going to kick things off here.
Thanks, Adam. It's such a pleasure to have a chance to participate in the Charleston conference this year, and we're all really thrilled that you've chosen to join us today, especially on a day when so many people are probably hitting reload on a map on a news quite regularly. Thank you for putting that aside and joining us for what I think is going to be a very, very interesting discussion about how big the big deal is and some of the characteristics of the local environment that are so important in evaluating these packages. I'm thrilled about the panel that we've brought together today. Joe Esposito, Nerea Llamas, and Amy Pawlowski will be speaking. Joe from Clark and Esposito, Nerea from UNC Chapel Hill, and Amy from Ohio Link. And our format will be that first Nerea and then Amy will each speak for a few minutes about their own perspectives from two different institutional contexts. And then Joe will speak a little bit and we'll have some time for questions. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Nerea.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I wanted to start by providing just a bit of context about the UNC libraries. Of course, we're a research library and we support disciplines from across the campus, from humanities and social sciences to the sciences, health sciences, and medicine. We have quite a large health sciences and medical complex on our campus. So that's an important part of what we do. Like many libraries, we have participated in numerous big deals or bundled packages over the years, but only recently have we really started to think about, to dig in and think carefully about the impact of these big deals as such on our overall collection strategy. So before I go any further, I'll stop and I'll say that really before this panel came together, I never really thought much about the term big deal and how I used it. I used it fairly indiscriminately, I would say, and without really thinking about the characteristics or criteria for what makes up a big deal. Pretty much anything that was an inclusive agreement with a large publisher qualified in my mind as a big deal. As I think more about it in the context of UNC libraries, I do believe that the big deal, however you choose to define it, is less and less relevant to us locally. We have many agreements, as our peers do, and like others, we embrace big deals early on at a time when they seemed to be good for our budgets, when they seem to save us staff time, and seem to bring lots of content to our campus, which is, of course, what we all want. Now, however, with our current budget and staffing, they have become entirely unsustainable. UNC's big deals are shrinking in number and scope. And if I use my earlier criteria, what I can say is that UNC only has 2 of these big deals left. We have one with Springer that includes journals and ebooks, so fairly inclusive, and one with Sage that is for journals, but it has been transformed into a read and publish. All of our other packages are much smaller in scope and in cost and are much more curated. This is intentional, of course, and largely the result of a budget that has been consistently shrinking since 2008. By the time I arrived 2 years ago in 2018, packages with Wiley, Cambridge, and others had already been canceled. And this year, as many may know, we canceled our Elsevier package. All of this has really been an attempt to gain greater flexibility in our budget, even if that means paying higher per title or per unit costs. Amy, could you go on? Actually, I realized we maybe need to go to slide 3. Sorry, I have to remember. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our values. As I said earlier, the shrinking has happened gradually, but we really did not define an approach to our collection strategy until early 2019, when we formalized our sustainable scholarship strategy. Sustainable scholarship really articulates 4 values that we approach our collections with and our negotiations with. The first is affordability, and that's maybe the most obvious. And affordability really thinks about, is our pricing fair? And can we support a particular price for any package or any subscription that we take on? Sustainability really looks at, can we do this over time and for how long? It may be that we can't sustain something forever, but we could sustain it for the next few years. And so it's important for us to understand what might be our limitations in terms of sustainability. Transparency, practically speaking, means that we do not sign non-disclosure agreements. If one is required, we certainly will do our best to negotiate and change the language of an agreement, but ultimately, if a publisher or vendor insists on a non-disclosure agreement, we will walk away from that resource. Open access is about moving our collections generally toward opening up more content and prioritizing opportunities to do that. And that could be in a variety of ways. That could be through transformational agreements, but it can also be supporting other open initiatives. And we're very early on in this process and trying to think about ways to do that as our budget continues to shrink. I will say we are looking at another budget cut this year, though we don't know what that is, even though we're in November. And so that becomes very tricky, but it is something we're committed to doing here at UNC. Amy, could you go on to the next slide? So along with our stated values at UNC, we're also examining more and more the issue of just value of a package. And we're looking at this very closely. So often publishers or vendors will boil down value to cost per use. And the idea being that lower cost per use is better value. And of course, that makes a lot of sense from a certain perspective. But it only makes sense if you have a budget that's robust enough to fund every package that shows low cost per use. We don't have that luxury any longer. We can no longer afford to fund many of our resources that in fact do have low cost per use for us. So in our case, cost per use has become one of many data points, but not the primary data point. Increasingly, we're asking ourselves, how high is the local need for immediate access? Even if we know faculty in particular departments are using heavily resources, we still ask ourselves, do they need immediate need? Can I meet their need through interlibrary loan? Can I purchase articles on demand for them? And will that meet their need? Is it really worth a subscription or paying for perpetual access right now in order to provide access? And in a library like ours, with shrinking staff, our capacity to negotiate licenses, sign licenses, maintain these agreements, maintain changes in our catalog are also important considerations. These take lots of time and energy, and we have to be able to sustain these agreements after we've signed them. I will say my technical services unit has had 4 retirements this year alone, and that's on top of at least 10 or more long-term vacancies, many that we won't necessarily be able to replace. So this has become one of the central points in thinking about our agreements. Amy, could you go on to the next slide, please? So overall at UNC Libraries, we're employing a philosophy of transformation that has and will continue to move us away from the big deals, again, however you choose to define what these big deals look like, and towards supporting our defined values. And one of the important aspects of this is to create greater flexibility in our budget. in order to respond not only to the emerging needs that we have, but also to the continual budget cuts that we have seen and will likely continue to see as all of our campuses face times during the pandemic. We have to do this. There is no other choice but for us to create greater flexibility. And we will build more space through this flexibility, not only for those budget cuts, but to support more open access with our purchasing decisions. It is something that we are definitely committed to, and committed enough to say that this is a priority for us. And increasingly, we're going to support more digital delivery, something that we and other libraries are focusing on in our current remote learning environments. This is definitely evolving, and I want to be clear to say we're not saying digital only, and it certainly doesn't mean that we will stop purchasing print, as some have heard that to mean. It is not that is not the case at all. But in this remote learning environment, we understand how important it is to be able to deliver our collections, our current collections and the ones that we purchase in a digital environment whenever possible. So as we approach collections, big deals, or otherwise now into the future, transformation will be key to us. I think I will stop there. Thank you so much, and I'll pass the mic on to Amy.
Sorry for the giant slide flip through there, everyone. Thank you, Nerea. So Nerea really started outlining the complex journey and about her evaluation and how they're thinking about things at an individual institution. And now I'm going to cover the evaluation at a consortial level. Because as we have in our session description, that evaluating these packages is complex and time intensive and multi-layered, and how you get to your answers does really depend on the type of institution or consortia that you are in. So to lead this off, for OhioLink, the question for us isn't should we have big deals or large journal packages, as we come to call them, but rather, do our content contracts make sense for the collective and at our individual institutions? And I want to stress that at our individual institutions. So why am I saying that? Let me give you a little bit of a background of OhioLink. We are 116 member libraries, which is at 88 institutions. So 14 publics, 51 privates, 23 community colleges, 16 regional campuses, and then we also have 8 law schools, 5 medical schools, and we also in OhioLink have the State Library of Ohio and the Cleveland Clinic. We have a wide range, a broad spectrum of institution types. So 5 ARLs, small theological unions, and then colleges of arts and music. So we're really kind of a spectrum, and when we're thinking about making collection decisions, we're thinking about it from a holistic level. Maybe about 5 years ago or so, we put down on paper collection development guideline principles. And this was really around how are we making our decisions, and where are we finding value to justify our decisions. So really quickly, our content has to meet statewide strategic and sustainable priorities for education and research. We are a state agency. We do report up to the Department of Higher Education. So anything that we work towards, we have to make sure we're supporting that. Decisions about and support for content are made by the member organizations. And this is really important. I don't sit in my office at OhioLink with the rest of the OhioLink staff and go through potential resources and decide if it's something that our members can subscribe to or not. We have a resource committee that meets once a month with a large representative. So we have charter members, we have 1 reps from each of the charters, and then a handful of reps for the independents, and then a handful of reps for the 2 years, to make sure that when we are talking about the content that we are approaching or putting to the membership is content that everybody needs and everybody is interested in. I have this next one highlighted because we're going to talk about this and how this plays out in the following slides. There is a high need across the majority of the membership, so what we call basic resources. And that maybe wasn't the case for OhioLink pre-2008 recession. And then what we saw over that recession was the resource committee kind of coming back and saying, we need to cut some resources, we need to do some trimming. And where that group landed after that really is a solid, what we consider a basic package of resources that fits the needs of all of our members. The next one, there's a firm commitment on sufficient funds from the membership basic resources or the research intensive membership research resources. This is because I'm not going to go find a deal and then try to chase after money to make something go. And this kind of leans on our members are deciding what content we're picking as a group and not individually. The next one, price savings are substantially better than individual institutional purchases or subscriptions. This is hands down it. If we're working through a deal and I see that one of our members would be paying more than what we call street price, so we don't necessarily say list price, we say street price, because we all know that at some point you're going to get perhaps some sort of discount, right? If I see my member or one of our members getting really close in one of our pricing allocations, then we really need to start rethinking things and rethinking what that package is and how it's working for the organization. And then the last one, the management of the content supports efficiencies for staffing at OhioLink and membership institutions. And I think Nerea really pointed out a lot of the challenges that go with giant packages of journals versus title by title. Like there's still work involved. There's still administrative work involved in whatever kind of content decisions. Okay, so I wanted to dig in a little bit about one of our evaluations of one of our large journal packages. And I need to give a shout out to Joanna Voss, who was our data analyst, our collections analyst at OhioLink. Joanna and I ran this study analysis with our resource committee members, so a large majority of our members. And we asked our members two questions. We asked them, what could you afford if the OhioLink deal wasn't in place? And then what do you define as necessary content, right? So two different questions kind of getting to do two different important decisions. So this first slide that I have up is what could you afford individually? So no surprise that 61% of the titles that we currently have would not be subscribed to. That's current content would be lost. This is, again, I want to point out what you could afford. So that 61% isn't necessarily content that they do not want. It's just content that they simply could not afford. So they were making, when they were going through this exercise, making difficult decisions about title levels. And I want to point out that when we asked our members to go through this, OhioLink at the center did not define how they got to what they could afford, what their list is for what they could afford, or what their list is for what they need. They got to define that locally. And I think that's an important point, right? Because at each of our institutions, they have different programs and different content needs. Interestingly, across the consortium in our package, this particular package, 99.8% of the titles were used in 2019. So that says something big, right? You can't afford 61% of that content, but what a lot of our members saw was that was still getting used, and they were making difficult decisions about, well, it's getting used, but do I really need it for a particular program? And then the big difference between what libraries could afford and what they could purchase and what they deem necessary are slightly different. So let's take a look at that. I am going to look at my notes for this one. So this is the question, what titles are necessary? And again, I didn't tell them how to decide what's going on. I didn't tell them to look at their programs. I didn't tell them to look at cost per use. They each made their own decisions with their local evaluations. So if you take a look at this, you'll see that there's about 15% of the collection that no one really said was completely necessary, but hold on, I'm going to keep going here. About 23% said 23%. So 5 to 9 libraries said 23% of the content package was necessary for them. The next one, 15 to 19 libraries that grade at 3% said that 3% of journals were necessary. And then you move into this, what Joanne and I kind of called the consortial sweet spot, right? So if anybody's played baseball or golf, you know exactly where you want to hit the ball and the bat to make it go even further, right? I coach softball, so it's an analogy I use a lot. So this consortial sweet spot here, 47%. 1 to 4 libraries of that 40%. So what this means, when you start looking at how this works out, and you're overlaying the cost of these journals and what it would cost them individually, locally, without a consortial deal, what you find is that library, the funding that they're putting in for that one journal that they deem necessary, by pulling their money, they're getting access to the rest of that content in that light blue box, right? So it isn't just about you can afford, in a consortial setting, it's about you can afford this, but because other people need this and they can afford it, and we're going through strong negotiations, they're able to gain access to a lot more content. To the right of that, I have a chart, and this speaks to marked necessary by number of libraries. So 1 or more library, the percentage of titles is 85%. And then the percentage of list price of that is 95%. And then we have percentage of 2019 usage. And this also gets to that when we're taking a look at a package. This is going to get to that 15% not necessary content, because we looked at that and we thought, oh, well, what if we just trim, you know, that 15% out of the content package? However, those journals were lower priced journals. And there weren't a lot of savings to be had there, right? The journals that are getting used and the journals that are more expensive are sitting at that top and are more often identified as must-have journals. So this just kind of goes through that, that chart kind of goes through looking at the percentage of titles, but also taking into account the actual list price and the usage. Okay. The last thing that we talk about at a consortial level is efficiencies and challenges. And Nerea talked to this really well earlier. We're not just looking at making sure that we're gathering content and making sure everybody gets what they need. We're talking through at a consortial level what that means for everyone. So for an example, an efficiency that we have at OhioLink, I don't have, well, it sits under the second bullet. Nerea talked about cataloging of those records. Well, at OhioLink, we identified that as an efficiency to be had. So we started cataloging records locally in the OhioLink offices and distributing those records to our members to then put in their local catalogs or tweak however they want to before they put into their local catalog. Another efficiency that we've seen at the consortial level, and especially when you have a deal that, you know, if your consortium has been hammering on the year-over-year increases, you're going to bring your pricing down. So you're going to be sitting in a very different position 10 years later if you're able to negotiate lower year-over-year increases for your package, right? That's not something that you can do readily or easily when you're purchasing content title by title. So that's something that we talk about as a group as one of the advantages. I wanted to toss out, we had a resource committee last week, and unfortunately, well, unfortunately for us, fortunately for her, one of our longstanding members in the resource committee is getting ready to retire. And she was around in the late 90s when OhioLink was formed, and they were really thinking about where do we need to start with these deals and how are they moving forward. And I have a quote from her, and I wanted to talk about this because I think it's important and it has been lost over the years in the conversation about consortial deals or large journal packages. So she had mentioned that in 1997, when OhioLink negotiated its first journal package contract, the price increase negotiated was 9.9%. So OhioLink negotiated a 9.9% increase initially, year over year. And at that time, when standard journal prices or increases were in the 16 to 19% range, right? So at that time, you were all seeing 16 to 19% year over year increases for journals. That absolutely, it was unsustainable. So the community responded in several ways, and one of which is consortial deals. So even that 9.9, that's a ridiculous number. No one's, well, some medical schools might still be paying that because they're having a hard time trying to figure out ways to put pressure on to bring that pricing down. But that was a big deal. That was groundbreaking back then to get under 10% of an increase. And, somewhere along the way, I think large journal packages in a sense has kind of gotten a bad rap. But I wanted to talk today about, please don't jump to conclusions. A lot of us are doing a lot of analysis, a lot of deep analysis, and taking a close look at everything and making decisions locally that make sense to them. This isn't about trying to keep money in the system for OhioLink. Everything that OhioLink is doing and deciding is for the benefit of our institutions and our students. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nerea and Amy. So now I'm going to begin the kind of panel part of of our presentation. I'll start by asking a question of Joe to get us started, but just want to note for everyone here, if you have any questions for the panel, please pop them in the chat, and we'll try to address them in just a couple of minutes. But for now, I'd like to start by asking Joe a question, which is, tell us a little bit about what this looks like from the publisher perspective. What's the perspective on the big deal now that we've heard a little bit from two very different library perspectives? What things look like from publishers' perspective?
Well, I think the answer to that depends on how you define certain terms. One of them is the whole term of the big deal. And as Nerea has said, just what is a big deal? It's a term that requires some specificity to be meaningful. But the other term is, what is a publisher? And let me focus on that for a moment. We tend in this community to talk about publishers as though Elsevier represented all publishers. And I would say that the other publisher would say, would that were true. But in fact, it's not true. The publishers, there are thousands of publishers, and they all have different perspectives on large aggregations, whether you call them big deal or otherwise. I would break the publishers into three groups. They're the very large ones that do aggregations. That is to say that they not only have a large portfolio of their own, but they also are developing licensing agreements with smaller publishers, typically society publishers. And you know the names here. Preeminently, you've got Wiley, but you have Elsevier, Springer Nature, Taylor and Francis, and so on. So these are large entities that are bringing in any number of publishers, which then puts them in a position to offer very, very large packages of big deals. The second group of publishers you point to are those publishers that are much smaller publishers that have felt that it's in their interest to do a deal with a large publisher. That is called a PSA, a Publishing Services Agreement. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals on the platforms of those large publishers that are in fact not owned by the large publishers, but they are produced and marketed by the large publishers. The large publishers then in turn pay a royalty to those various society publishers. And then finally, you've got one other group, which is the shrinking group, and that is the group of the independent publisher. There are very few independent small commercial publishers left. They've all been bought up by the larger publishers. There are, of course, hundreds of society publishers out there, more than anybody ever imagines until you start to look into that. But they are finding, for the most part, it's very challenging to remain an independent publisher. So when you look at the different categories of publisher, you see that the big deal has different meaning. If you are an independent society publisher, a small publisher, the big deal is a deadly threat, because the big deal is something that large publishers use to suck all of the budget out of libraries, leaving nothing left over for those smaller publishers. If you are in fact a society publisher that has signed a publishing services agreement with a large publisher, they are counting on those aggregations to generate the royalty income that they require. So it's probably not useful to talk about publishers as though it's a general term. You have to get a little bit I wouldn't say in the weeds, but you have to think about them categorically and not as a single group in order to understand how these aggregations work. As far as a definition of the big deal, I don't know if I have much to add to what Nerea was saying about that. I prefer to think of them as large aggregations, and I would make the distinction between aggregations that cross various subject areas and aggregations that are more specific in a single area. A package, for example, in high energy physics, which has multiple journals, is one thing. A package that includes anthropology, history, biology, chemistry, and so forth is something else entirely. Those large packages that are not curated, that do not have subject matter parameters, are, I think, increasingly endangered, because when they come under tight usage analysis, it's shown that only a small number of those journals and those packages are generating much of the usage. And I think that group is under a lot of pressure in the current economic environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. So we have one or two questions that have already come in, but I'd like to ask a question of my own just to get us started. We've seen you've talked about the big deals in a certain set of ways. Some people have talked about big deals or transformative deals as being transitional in some sense. And I'm wondering, I think it was Nerea who spoke about a big deal that includes books. We've seen packages that even in some cases include things that aren't publications, like databases or other kinds of tools. I just wonder if anyone would like to comment on some of these other ways that that these packages are being scoped out, or some of the ways in which they're moving towards a kind of transformed model directionally, if that's something that anyone wants to observe upon.
I can give a few examples, Roger. For OhioLink, we have, my exact example is something that you pointed out. For OhioLink, at one point we cut a contract with a publisher that included journals and then large data sets, right? So not a traditional grouping of resources to get towards a quote unquote big deal, but it was a way for us to reduce pricing for each of us and our members. So we call it the art of the possible at OhioLink, which is really around how can we hit as many of our purchasing goals, what we've defined as our good ROI measures, and get to that space. And that's what makes it so hard to start thinking about, quote unquote big deals and things, right? We're putting together packages that work for the community, and if it's a combination of resources, it's a combination of resources. Sometimes it's just a journal package.
Yeah, I'll maybe pick up there and say that I, in my time, have seen many, many different configurations of these things. And sometimes it is some different kinds of resources that go into the same package. Sometimes it is a package of journals where the pricing goes down slightly if you do a big one-time purchase of something else today. If you do this today, we'll put you in a cheaper package for the next 3 years, right? It's this kind of balancing of how much you're spending with a particular publisher or vendor. and just putting together things that are going to be attractive for the library or for the group of libraries in the moment, and that are going to generate the best pricing. I would say that's maybe a little bit different from a transformational agreement or a transitional agreement, where we're looking to really change what the parameters of those agreements look like. And I can talk maybe in this space a little bit about our SAGE agreement, where we do continue to have all of our journals in the package, but half of the money for our package actually goes to the publishing aspect. So that's really thinking about starting to pay for publishing rather than just paying for content on the back end. And that's more where we would like to be moving toward, is to think about where our money is going, and to be paying for publication, to be paying for output, as opposed to just be paying for a subscription and archival access to that subscription.
We had a couple of questions come in that I'd like to try to group together, one from Rick Anderson and one from Todd Puccio. Looking in one case about some of the kind of input and feedback from faculty members when Chapel Hill was contemplating or planning cancellations. And then from Todd, sort of asking about the perspective of university administrators. I suppose that would be the president or the provost or deans or what have you, and trying to understand if, in his experience, that some of those folks really love the big deal. They see it as a recruiting tool for certain kinds of, I suppose, faculty recruitment, student recruitment, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which, both in a consortial setting, Amy, and in an institutional setting, Nerea, you're kind of incorporating feedback or input from those kinds of stakeholders?
Sure. When we started looking at our Elsevier package almost 2 years ago now, this is the point that we launched our sustainable scholarship campaign, and we went to faculty. We talked to faculty a lot about sustainable scholarship, not just Elsevier. We talked to departments, we did town halls, we talked to small groups, we talked to graduate students. So we did a lot of work in talking to the campus about what it meant to have a sustainable scope of materials in our library and resources that would fit our budget, and drill down a little bit to our Elsevier package, because that's the one we were negotiating at the time. And so we really prepped faculty, not knowing exactly where our negotiation would go. And ultimately, by the time we got to the point of walking away from the package and going to a title by title, we specifically asked them to tell us more about how they use content, not what content did they want or not want. And so we were very targeted in our questions, and then used that to create our title by title list. By the time we got to that point and announced that we were walking away from the package, faculty were really aware of where we were headed and the reasons why. And so that was very different from earlier packages where we simply said, we don't have budget, we can't afford this, and tell us what you want to see on campus. And so not all faculty were happy, obviously, but they understood, and some even congratulated us on this work and making a stand in this space. Administrators, in my experience during this time, really didn't understand the big deal at all, really didn't understand packages at all. They were more concerned about how faculty would react and would faculty have access to the content that they needed. They didn't really understand how we provide that content. And of course, they're concerned about not having access, but they really didn't weigh in on how we provide that access, or even understand what that looks like. So it's interesting to me to see that there are administrators who are really who have really latched onto this idea of the big deal and being able to provide all that content. And maybe I'll just quickly add that one of the problems for us in having all of these packages means that we're squeezing out some content, and particularly for humanities and social sciences, that we can't provide. And so part of our explanation for what we're doing is to say that it can't just be these other packages. It can't just be the sciences and the health sciences that get all the content and everybody else loses out. We have to find a way to be equitable in this space and to bring the variety of content that we need on the campus.
Sorry, there's a related question that came in that might help us to refocus this on a consortial level, which is, and Amy, I don't know if how you've thought about this, but clearly you have an extensive program of gathering input and engaging the consortial members in the decision-making processes, and you've kind of walked through that for us pretty carefully. The question is whether a model a little bit more like the one that Nerea has described could work at a consortial or statewide level, and I don't know if I don't know exactly how to think about that precisely, but maybe one or the other, both of you have some thoughts about that, or whether it's strictly institutional in the way that works.
Well, I don't know, Roger. I mean, a model could work. There could be an instance where our institutions are taking a model and using that locally, and then sending us the output. And then centrally, we're taking that output and doing an analysis. What I think would be different is the conclusions that you draw from the data, right? Because the conclusions you draw from an individual institution and how they're looking at what content to keep and what content not to keep versus the same scenario in a consortial level, those decisions are going to be very different. And that kind of gets to that, I was talking about that sweet spot in a consortial deal. Like why would you cancel a big deal or a large journal package if you're going to go out and spend the same amount of money because you have to with the content that you need, really? So it isn't about the model that you're using and can you use the same model. It's just on the back end, the analysis and the value is going to be looked at differently for an individual institution versus a consortia.
I'm not managing my mute button while I apologize. We only have about 3 or 4 minutes left. I do want to ask one more question for Joe, but I think it would be interesting to hear if the other panelists wanted to engage with this as well. This question comes from Sarah Rui. Do you consider transformational agreements, transformative agreements, to have the same kind of impact as the big deals that you described in terms of how they threaten independent publishers? I think really kind of a question taking us out of the negotiation space and into the kind of publisher ecosystem space. I think it would be really interesting to reflect on that for just a moment or two, and certainly would be happy to hear from Amy and Nerea as well.
Transformation agreements in the form that they're currently being promulgated are indeed a challenge for smaller publishers. They're a challenge for a number of reasons. First of all, it's very difficult to get the attention of the buyer, the purchaser, for these negotiations because the buying consortia or the national groups that are negotiating these rarely have the time to talk to smaller publishers. I was indeed a few years ago told by the head of a major academic consortium that she simply had no time to talk with anybody with a small portfolio. So that's true whether it's a big deal or a transformative agreement, that there are certain industrial efficiencies in working with big collections, and smaller publishers tend to lose out there. But the second part of that that's also important is that the smaller publishers don't necessarily have the tools to negotiate these deals. They are sitting across the table from people who are negotiating these deals for a living. The publishers negotiate these things perhaps once in 5 years. And as a consequence of that, they're really at a disadvantage to understand what can be done with this. And finally, the other point here is that the kind of compensation on a per article basis through these deals does not support the cost structure that these independent publishers tend to have. So yes, the transformative agreements are, generally speaking, desirable perhaps by the community, but in implementing them, it's going to be very difficult for some members of the community, especially small publishers, to participate. And indeed, many of them feel threatened with their very existence because of them.
Well, it's a reminder that there are very different models available out there, and the array of both publishing models as well as the local environment, as we've been discussing today, certainly suggests the need for something other than a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think we've reached the end of our time together. So I'd just like to thank Amy, Nerea, and Joe for participating today, and to all the folks at the Charleston Conference for making this possible. Hope to see you in person next year.